Welcome back to the deep dive. I have to say, I've been staring at this stack of notes for the last 3 days, and I am still trying to wrap my head around the sheer scale of what we're about to discuss. Usually, we look at a specific historical event or maybe a trend in tech, but today we are diving into something that touches the very bedrock of how over 1 billion people understand history, law, and faith.
Yeah, massive doesn't quite cover it. We are looking at what is arguably one of the most significant and certainly one of the most controversial intellectual debates in modern Islamic thought.
hmm
And it's not just a debate about, specific rules. It is a debate about the definition of truth itself.
Exactly. We are tackling a stack of sources that center around the work of the scholar G.A. Parwez. Specifically, his book Maqam-e-Hadith, which translates to the position of Hadith, along with some accompanying notes on the primacy of the Quran. And look, I want to set the stage right now for you listening. Usually when we talk about history, we are arguing about dates or battles. This deep dive is different. This is an argument about the architectural blueprints of a religion.
Precisely. And I think before we get into the weeds, we need to start with a very clear, very bold disclaimer, just given the weight of this topic. Our mission today is to act as neutral reporters. We are unpacking the arguments presented in these specific texts by Parwez. We aren't taking sides. We aren't issuing fatwas or endorsing a specific school of thought. We are simply here to ask one fundamental question. What is the argument being made by the author, and how does he construct his case?
Right. We are just the guides through the text today. And the argument here is, well, it is incredibly provocative. It is essentially a proposal to reclassify an entire body of literature, the Hadith, which are the recorded sayings and actions attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, to reclassify them from being a source of divine law to being a source of history.
That is the headline right there. To move hadith from the realm of deen, which implies binding religious obligation and eternal truth, to the realm of tarikh, or history.
And to the uninitiated listener, or maybe someone who doesn't follow this theology closely, that might sound like a subtle administrative change, like, oh, just move these files from folder A to folder B. But as we went through these notes, it became clear that this changes, it changes everything. How you pray, how you make laws, how you view the prophet, how you organize a state.
It really pulls the rug out from under the traditional understanding of jurisprudence. And it starts with a fundamental question that the source poses right at the beginning. It is a question of epistemology, a fancy word for how do we know what we know. He asks, if the Quran is the absolute truth, what is the status of traditions collected centuries later? Can faith rely on probability, or does it require absolute certainty?
That distinction between probability and certainty is where we really have to start. The source uses two very specific Arabic terms that come up again and again in this text, haq and zen. I want us to really unpack these because if you don't get this, you just don't get the rest of the argument.
So haq implies absolute immutable truth. It is reality. It is rock solid. In the framework of these sources, haq is exclusively the Quran. The author argues that the Quran is the only text that carries a divine guarantee of protection. He cites the verse where God explicitly says, "We have revealed the reminder, and we are its guardians."
Okay, so that is the anchor. The Quran is the haq. It is the one constant variable in the equation.
Correct. Everything else, according to Parwez, falls under the category of zan. Now, zan is a tricky word. It translates to conjecture, guesswork, opinion, or even a strong impression. It's something that might be true, it is probably true, but it isn't certainly true.
So it is the difference between seeing a car crash with your own eyes, which is haq, and hearing your neighbor tell you about a car crash you heard about from his cousin, which would be zan.
That is a perfect analogy. And the source quotes a verse from the Quran regarding this that seems to be the foundational pillar of his logic. The verse states conjecture, or zan, is of no avail against the truth, or haq. The core argument here is that deen, the faith you base your salvation on, cannot be built on a foundation of maybe.
Because if you were going to say God wants you to do X, you need 100% certainty.
Exactly. And the source argues that history, by definition, is human reporting. It is subject to memory loss, bias, telephone game distortions, and editing. Therefore, history can never be deen.
This reminds me of that part in the notes about the two revelations, because I think a lot of people listening who have a background in this might be thinking, wait a minute, isn't the Hadith also revelation, just not the recited kind? Isn't that the standard Orthodox belief?
You were absolutely right. That is the standard view. It is referred to as the concept of wahi matlu, which is recited revelation like the Quran, and wahi ger matlu, unrecited revelation, which is the Hadith. The idea is that the prophet received revelation that wasn't part of the Quran, and he expressed it in his own words.
So effectively, they are Both from God, just packaged differently.
That is the traditional argument.
Yeah.
But Maqami Hadith, the source we are analyzing, absolutely rejects this. Parges argues that this division has zero basis in the Quran itself. He claims the Quran never even hints at a second silent revelation that carries legal authority.
And he actually goes further than just saying it's not in the Quran. He argues that this concept mimics Jewish traditions, right?
He does. He draws a direct parallel. In Rabbinic Judaism, you have the written Torah given to Moses, and then you have the Mishnah and Gemara, the oral traditions that explain the Torah. Parwez argues that early Muslim scholars, many of whom were converts or lived in a cosmopolitan environment, they subconsciously adopted this dual source structure.
Because they felt the Quran wasn't detailed enough. We will definitely get to that point later. But they elevated the history to the status of hidden revelation to fill the gaps.
Filling the gaps, exactly. But sticking with this idea of two revelations, the source brings up a logical contradiction involving the prophet himself. Parwez asks, if Hadith was revelation, why didn't the prophet preserve it?
This is one of the strongest logical pivots in the text.
Right, because if God wanted the Hadith to be part of the deen, part of the eternal guidance, he would have preserved it just like the Quran. And if the prophet believed his own words were hidden revelation, he would have ordered them to be written down, vetted, and secured.
But he didn't. In fact, the source says he did the exact opposite.
Correct. And this brings us to the prohibition on writing. The source argues that the preservation method for Hadith was radically different from the Quran. In fact, Parwez claims it was practically non-existent for the first few centuries.
Let's talk about that prohibition, because action item 1.2 in our notes says, reclassify Hadith as history. Why? Because according to the source, the Prophet Muhammad explicitly told people not to write down his words.
It is a very specific narration,
Yeah.
and it's found in the canonical books themselves. The prophet is reported to have said, do not write from me anything other than the Quran. And whoever has written anything from me other than the Quran, let him erase it.
Let him erase it. That is incredibly strong language. It is not just, I'd prefer you didn't write this down. It is a command to delete.
The source asks us to pause and really think about the why here. If Hadith were meant to be the second half of the religion, why would the founder of the religion ban its recording? That would be like a professor giving a lecture on the material for the final exam and banning the students from taking notes. It just doesn't make sense unless the material wasn't meant for the exam.
So the argument is that the prophet wanted to prevent the mixture of divine scripture with human words.
Exactly. He wanted the Quran to stand alone as the exclusive authority. He didn't want a situation where people were holding two books, confused about which one was God's word and which one was the prophet's opinion.
But surely after the prophet passed away, his companions, the Sahaba, they started writing it down, right? I mean, human nature is to preserve the legacy of a leader. They must have realized they were losing this info.
You would think so. That is the logical assumption anyone would make. But the source paints a very different picture of the era of the caliphs. It focuses heavily on the first two caliphs, Abu Bakr and Umar. Let's look at Abu Bakr first.
This is the story about the burning. I remember reading this in the notes and doing a double take.
It's a really striking image. The source cites a historical report from Tadkirat al-Hufaz by al-Dahadi that Abu Bakr had collected about 500 traditions of the Prophet. He had them written down on scrolls.
Yeah.
But the report says he was uneasy. He spent a sleepless night tossing and turning.
What was keeping him up?
He was worried about accuracy. He was worried that he might have misheard, or that the narrators might be wrong, or that the context was missing. He realized that if he, the caliph, kept these written down, people would treat them as absolute truth, as haq. But he knew deep down they were only memory. They were zan.
So he made a decision.
He called his daughter Aisha, who was keeping the scrolls, and he burned them.
The first caliph burned the Hadith collection. That contradicts the entire narrative of preservation we usually hear.
According to the source, yes, it completely contradicts it. And then we have the story of Umar, the second caliph. This one is even more detailed. Umar apparently considered compiling the traditions into a book to help with legal rulings. He consulted the companions for a month.
A whole month of deliberation. This wasn't a snap decision he made over breakfast.
No, it was a major state policy review. And ultimately, he decided against it. His famous declaration was, "The Book of Allah is sufficient for us." Hasbuna kitabullah. He explicitly warned the people, saying, "I remember the people who were before you. They wrote other books and abandoned the Book of Allah. By Allah, I will not clothe the Book of Allah with anything else."
The Book of Allah is sufficient. That phrase seems to be the beating heart of Parwez's entire argument.
It absolutely is. And the source claims that during the time of the rightly guided caliphs, this was the official stance. They actively discouraged and sometimes imprisoned companions who were too obsessed with spreading hadith. They wanted the focus to remain 100% on the Quran. They sent teachers to new cities with the instruction, do not distract the people with stories. Teach them the Quran.
It is fascinating because it frames the early caliphate not as the golden age of hadith, but as the golden age of Quranic focus. So if the prophet banned it and the caliphs burned or blocked it, when did the books we have today actually get written? When did Bukhari and Muslim, the big names on the spine of the books, come onto the scene?
That is the time gap. And this is the part that is often glossed over in standard historical overviews. The source emphasizes that the major canonical books, the Sihah were not compiled until the 3rd century Hijri. We're talking about roughly 200 to 250 years after the prophet's death.
2.5 centuries. Let's try to visualize that for you listening. That is like us right now in the 2020s trying to write down the exact verbatim conversations of George Washington from 1776, relying only on what your grandpa told you his grandpa told him.
And imagine doing that without any written records from the interim. Just oral storytelling. The source calls it the ultimate game of telephone. Think about the implications of oral transmission. A story is told by person A to person B. Person B tells it to person C 30 years later. Person C tells person D. By the time it reaches the compiler in the year 250, it has passed through 5, 6, or 7 intermediaries.
And we know from psychology, from history, from just talking to our friends, stories change, details get added, tone shifts, context is entirely lost.
Precisely. And Parwaz argues this isn't just about innocent memory loss. The source discusses the political context of those 250 years. Those were not peaceful centuries. There were massive civil wars. The Umayyads versus the Abbasids versus the Alids. There were huge sectarian splits.
And each group had an incentive to control the narrative.
Exactly. The source argues that every political faction started fabricating hadith to support their claim to power. One side says, the prophet said the caliph should be from this tribe. The other side says, no, the prophet said he should be from that tribe. The market was completely flooded with forgery.
So by the time Bukhari and Muslim come onto the scene, they aren't walking into a pristine library of facts. They're walking into a minefield of rumors.
A total minefield. And this leads us to the science of men, or Asma Urjal. This was the method the compilers used to verify these stories. Since you couldn't check the facts because the event was 200 years ago and there were no recordings, you had to check the reputation of the narrators.
This is the chain of narration verification, basically asking, is this guy trustworthy?
Right. But the source offers a really stinging critique of this method. It argues that character judgment is inherently subjective. Parwaz points out that Asma Urjal is essentially just a collection of biographies. Narrator X was a pious man. Narrator Y had a bad memory in his old age. Narrator Z was a liar.
But who wrote these bios?
Other men, with their own biases and political leanings.
It gives examples of this subjectivity in the text, doesn't it?
It does. It points out that you will often find one scholar declaring a narrator thika, meaning trustworthy or reliable, while another scholar declares the exact same person a complete liar or weak. If I am a supporter of the Umayyads, I might call a Shia narrator a liar. If I am Shia, I might call an Umayyad narrator untrustworthy.
So it is entirely opinion-based.
Completely. And Parwaz asks, can you base your deen, the system that determines your eternal salvation or damnation, on the subjective opinions of historians regarding the character of people they never even met?
That really puts it into perspective. If deen requires certainty and character references from 1,200 years ago are essentially opinion pieces, then the math just doesn't work.
Speaking of math, the statistics provided in the source are fascinating. Let's look at Imam Bukhari. The numbers here are just, well, they tell their own story.
Oh, these numbers blew my mind.
Right.
Walk us through the selection process.
The source states that Imam Bukhari selected approximately 7,000 hadiths, and that actually includes repetitions, for his book. But do you know how large the pool was that he started with?
The note said 600,000.
600,000 circulating traditions. He selected 7,000.
Wait, let's pause there. 600,000 available, 7,000 selected.
That is a rejection rate of nearly 99%.
So even the compilers, the guys who loved Hadith, who dedicated their entire lives to it, essentially said 99% of what people are saying the Prophet said is garbage.
Exactly. Now, the traditional narrative spins this as a positive. Look how amazing and strict Bukhari was. He filtered out all the garbage.
But Parwez flips that perspective completely.
Parwez looks at that and says, look how much garbage there was. He argues that this proves the atmosphere of the time was flooded with fabrications. And if you have a barrel of apples and 99% of them are rotten, can you be 100% sure that the last 1% you saved is truly safe? Or has the rot touched everything?
It is the concept of a poisoned well.
Right. He argues that even the Sahih, the authentic Hadiths, are just the best of a bad batch. Does that attain the level of haq, of absolute truth? The source argues no. It remains Zan.
There is another layer to this critique in the text regarding who these compilers were, the Ajami factor.
Yes, the geographical and cultural origin. The source points out that the 6 major compilers, Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah, Nisai, they were almost exclusively non-Arab. They were from the regions of Khorasan, Persia, and Central Asia.
And why does that matter to the argument? Is it just historical trivia, or is there a deeper point about language here?
It is central to the source's theory of Ajami, or non-Arab Persian influence. The argument is that these compilers were working in a time and place far removed from the cultural context of the Prophet's Arabia. They were collecting traditions that had been filtered through a Persian cultural lens.
This connects to the concept of riwayat bil mana, doesn't it?
It does. This is a technical term, but it's absolutely vital to understand. Riwayat bil lafz means transmitting the exact words, like a verbatim transcript. Riwayat bil ma'na means transmitting the meaning or the gist of what was said.
So the Prophet said X versus, I remember the Prophet saying something like X.
Correct. The source claims that scholars admit nearly all hadith are riwayat bil ma'ana. They are paraphrased interpretations. So we aren't actually reading the Prophet's speech, we are reading a translation of a memory of an interpretation. And when you have non-Arabs interpreting Arab idioms from centuries prior, the room for error just explodes.
Parwez suggests that this Ajami influence actually changed the very nature of the Prophet's image in the literature.
Yes. He argues that the Quran paints the Prophet as a human being. I am but a man like you to whom revelation is revealed. He doesn't know the unseen. He doesn't perform supernatural magic tricks. The miracle is the Quran. But then you open the Hadith books.
And water is flowing from his fingers, trees are walking over to say hi, he is ascending to the heavens on winged creatures.
Exactly. Parwez argues this is the Persian overlay. It turns the Prophet into a supernatural demigod, which contradicts the Quran, but fits perfectly with the Persian expectations of a King Messiah figure. So by prioritizing Hadith, we effectively overwrote the Quranic prophet with a mythological prophet.
That is a massive claim. It suggests we aren't just reading history, we are reading historical fiction written by a different culture. And this leads directly to what happens when these histories clash with the Quran, because the outline mentions theological conflicts.
This is where the rubber really meets the road. Abrogation and contradiction. The source discusses the concept of naskh, or abrogation.
This is the idea that a hadith can literally cancel out a Quran verse, right?
Yes. In traditional jurisprudence, if a hadith contradicts a Quranic verse, but the hadith is considered authentic and comes later in time, some scholars argue it abrogates or overrides the Quranic ruling.
And Parwez's take on this?
He calls it shirk.
Shirk. That is the heavy artillery, associating partners with God.
Yes, it is a very strong accusation. He argues that the Quran is the word of God. Hadith is the report of humans. To say a human report can overrule the divine text is, in his view, placing human authority above God. It is setting up a partner in legislation.
Can you give us an example from the text? Where does this actually happen in practice?
The text mentions the issue of bequest or written wills. The Quran explicitly allows a person to make a bequest to their parents or relatives. It is right in the text. It is prescribed for you, when death approaches one of you, if he leaves wealth, that he make a bequest to parents and next of kin. It is very clear.
Seems incredibly straightforward.
However, there's a famous hadith that says, there is no bequest for an heir.
So the Quran says make a bequest to parents. The Hadith says no bequest for heirs, which inherently includes parents. They're complete opposites.
A direct contradiction. Traditional jurisprudence generally follows the Hadith here. They say the Hadith abrogated the verse. Parwez says this is madness. You are taking a solitary report, an ahad narration attributed to one person, and using it to delete a command of God found in the Quran. He rejects the Hadith entirely in favor of the Quran.
It is a power struggle, essentially. Who has the final say, the text or the tradition?
And beyond the legal contradictions, the source points out narrative contradictions. This falls under rejecting narrations that violate reason or prophetic dignity.
Oh, the dignity aspect. This is where the source mentions mentions stories that just don't make the prophet look like a prophet.
Right. Parwez argues that the Quran establishes the character of the prophet. Dignified, rational, kind of incredibly high moral standard. But then you find narrations in the canonical books that attribute confusion or magic spells affecting the prophet, or just unbefitting behavior to him.
Like the story of Moses. I
Uh-huh.
need you to tell that one, because I couldn't believe it was in the canonical books when I read the notes.
It is in Sahih Bukhari. The narration says that the angel of death came to Moses in human form to take his soul. Moses recognized him and punched him in the face.
Punched the angel of death in the eye.
Punched him so hard he knocked his eye out.
He blinded an angel.
And the angel goes back to God with a missing eye and says, "You sent me to a servant who does not want to die." And God sixes the angel's eye.
Okay, that is.
Parwez asks, does this sound like a prophet of God? A prophet who violently assaults an angel? Does this sound like a rational event? Or does it sound like Jewish folklore that got mixed into the pile? He argues that because it contradicts the Quranic description of prophetic dignity, because prophets are those who submit to God's will, not punch angels, it must be false, regardless of who narrated it.
Reason over narration. That is the mantra here.
Dirayat, critical reasoning over blind narration. He argues that we've checked the messengers, the narrators, but we completely forgot to check the message.
Okay, so let's play devil's advocate for a second. Or rather, let's ask the question the listener is probably screaming at their device right now. If we toss out the Hadith, how do we know how to be Muslim? The Quran says, obey the messenger. If we don't have his words, how do we obey him? This is the fear, right? If we lose Hadith, we lose a prophet.
This is a huge pivot point for the entire philosophy.
Yeah.
The source anticipates this exact question. Parwez knows this is the mental block for most people.
So what is his answer?
The answer is a massive redefinition of obedience. The source argues that obedience to the messenger is obedience to the message he brought, which is the Quran. But he goes further. Parwez argues that obedience implies following the central Islamic system or state, the Markazi Milat.
The state.
Yes. He views the prophet not just as a preacher giving sermons, but as the head of a divine system. The prophet established a state in Medina. He was the chief executive.
The president, the judge, the general.
Right. So obey Allah and obey the messenger meant follow the law of God as implemented by the state authority of the messenger. It wasn't about how long is his beard or how high are his trousers. It was about don't break the treaty, pay your taxes, show up for defense. It was civic obedience.
So when the prophet was alive, obey the messenger meant follow the leader of the community. But he is gone now.
Exactly. And once the prophet passed away, Parwez argues that the central authority, the Markaz, didn't vanish. The obedience transfers to the legitimate consensus or state organization that is established based on the Quran. It does not mean obeying a book of historical anecdotes written 200 years later.
That is a massive shift in thinking. It changes Islam from a religion of personal rituals based on ancient texts to a collective system based on a living authority.
That is the core of his political theology. He distinguishes between deen, a collective system of life, and mazhab, a private religion of rituals. He actually hates the word mazhab. He says Islam came to establish deen. You can have a mazhab alone in a cave. You can only have deen in a functioning society.
And this leads to his redefinition of sunnah, because people use hadith and sunnah interchangeably all the time. It's sunnah to wear this, it's sunnah to eat that.
Parwez makes a very sharp distinction here. He says hadith are the stories, the verbal reports. Sunnah is the established practice or methodology.
Give me an example of the difference between the two.
Let's take the toothbrush example mentioned in the notes. People often say using a miswak, a specific type of twig from the arak tree, is sunnah.
Right, you see people using them to this day all over the world.
Parwez argues that the miswak was simply the toothbrush of 7th century Arabia. That was the available technology at the time. The habit of the prophet was using it. But the sunnah, the principle he was establishing, is oral hygiene.
So sticking a twig in your mouth isn't the point. Cleaning your teeth is the point.
Exactly. He argues that using a modern plastic toothbrush with fluoride toothpaste fulfills the sunnah of cleanliness better than the stick does today. If you blindly copy the form, the twig, you are following Arab custom. If you apply the principle, hygiene, using modern tools, you are following deen.
So blindly copying the 7th century form is not deen.
No, he calls that ajami thinking again, getting stuck in the form and losing the spirit. He argues that deen is applying the Quranic values to the modern context. This is what he calls dynamic Islam.
But what about prayer? What about salat? This is the ultimate gotcha question people throw out. The Quran tells us to pray, but doesn't say how. We need Hadith for the details of how to move and what to say.
Porwes has a very specific answer for this, tawatur, continuous mass practice. He argues that Salat was not established by Hadith books. Bukhari didn't teach Muslims how to pray. Muslims were praying for 250 years before Bukhari was even born.
Right, they didn't stop praying for 2 centuries waiting for the instruction manual to come out.
How did they learn? They learned by doing. The
Ah.
Prophet taught the community. The whole community prayed. They taught their kids. That generation taught the next. It wasn't passed down by a secret whisper, an ahad narration that one guy wrote down in a book. It was passed down by the amal, the action of the entire ummah.
So, just like we know where London is, not because we read a specific geography book written in 1850, but because everyone knows where London is, it is common lived knowledge.
Precisely. That is sunnah, the living tradition. Parwes accepts sunnah as the established practice transmitted by the masses. He rejects hadith as the verbal reports transmitted by isolated individuals. We pray because the Quran commands it, and the living tradition preserves the form. We don't pray because a book of history tells us to.
This brings us to the issue of unity. Because right now, the Muslim world is not exactly unified. We have Sunnis, Shias, Salafis, Sufis, and a million subgroups.
And the source places the blame for that fragmentation squarely on the hadith literature.
Really? The root of all division is the Hadith.
Think about it. The Quran is one. All Muslims, Sunni, Shia, Ibadi, they all agree on the exact text of the Quran. So where do they disagree?
Whose traditions they follow.
Exactly. The Shias have their own books of hadith, like Al-Kafi. The Sunnis have their own, like Bukhari. The Ahli Hadith prioritize different interpretations. The source argues that sectarianism stems from each group prioritizing different sets of contradictory historical reports.
So if you remove the contradictory history from the position of divine law,
You are left with the one common denominator, the Quran. The source argues that unity is only possible if we return to the Quran as the sole arbiter of faith. If we treat hadith as history, we can learn from it, we can debate it, but we stop excommunicating each other over it.
it turns the temperature down. It turns a massive theological war into a simple historical debate.
That is the goal, to unify the Ummah under the rope of Allah, the Quran, rather than scattering them among the pages of historians.
We've covered so much ground today. Let's look at the action items one more time before we wrap up, because this isn't just abstract theory. The notes lay out a real plan.
Right. The strategic plan for the listener who wants to adopt this mindset. Step 1. Establish the Quran as the absolute sole authority for deen. No partners. No hidden revelation. Step 2. Reclassify hadith as tariq, or history. It is valuable, it is interesting, but it is not binding law. Treat it like you treat any other historical source. Step 3. Use reason and Quranic principles to critique that history. If a story insults a prophet or contradicts the Quran, throw it out.
It is a profound call for critical thinking. It is shifting the burden of faith from memorizing ancient traditions to really understanding the system.
It creates a version of Islam that is fluid, rational, and adaptable to any era, rather than one that tries to freeze-frame the world in the year 632 AD.
But it is also a terrifying proposition for many people. We have to acknowledge that. It requires letting go of centuries of scholarly safety nets. It requires letting go of the comfort of having a pre-written answer for absolutely everything.
It does. It requires trusting the Quran completely, and that is the challenge Parwaz throws down. He asks, is the Quran enough, or do you need crutches?
And that leads me to our final thought. We always like to leave you with something to chew on after a deep dive. The argument here is that the Prophet banned writing. The caliphs burned the books. The Quran says it is sufficient. If God promised to preserve the reminder of the Quran, but he left the preservation of the Hadith to human effort, and it was prohibited by the Prophet himself, is the reliance on Hadith actually a lack of trust in the sufficiency of the Quran?
Are we trying to fill a gap that God intentionally intended to leave open? Because maybe the gap isn't a flaw. Maybe the gap is where our freedom to adapt lies.
A question worth a lifetime of reflection. We would love to hear what you think about this. This is a deep, deep rabbit hole, and we highly encourage you to read the sources, Makami Hades, for yourself. Don't just take our word for it.
Verify everything on your own.
That is the deep dive way. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.